I woke up at 3 a.m. to the roar of concrete trucks in my backyard. By the time I got outside in my bathrobe, the little creek my late wife loved more than anything, where she'd sit for hours just listening to the water, was buried under an illegal concrete dam. The HOA president, Veronica Ashworth, stood there smirking. Mosquito control, deal with it. What she didn't know, I'd spent 30 years as an EPA water quality specialist. I know every federal wetland regulation inside and out. One county complaint, one federal inspection, and her entire million-dollar neighborhood was suddenly redesignated as protected federal wetland, untouchable forever. What would you do if someone destroyed the last place that still brought you peace after losing your wife? Tell me in the comments and where you're watching from tonight. This story gets brutal. Trust me, you're going to cheer by the end. I'm Earl Hutchinson, 58 years old, and I live in the cottage where my wife Martha and I spent our final years together. The sound of Willow Creek flowing past our bedroom window used to lull her to sleep during those brutal chemo treatments. On bad nights, when the pain medication wasn't enough, she'd ask me to open the windows wider so she could hear the water better. Martha planted that oak grove by the water's edge during her second remission, when her oncologist said gardening therapy might help with depression. Every single tree was a small victory over cancer. She'd sit in her wheelchair directing me where to dig, her voice getting stronger with each sapling we planted. "Promise me something, Earl," she'd said during her final hospital stay, tubes snaking around her frail arms. "If anything ever threatens this place, you fight for it. Don't let them destroy beautiful things just because they can." The morning coffee steam still mixes with creek mist, the same way it did when Martha would sit on our back porch, wrapped in her favorite quilt, the blue one her grandmother made. Those creaking floorboards where her wheelchair used to roll still echo through the house sometimes, especially on quiet mornings when the fog hangs low over the water. I've been retired from the EPA for 3 years now, spending my days caring for my father's advancing dementia, while my daughter Sarah visits on weekends from her environmental law practice in Portland. The house smells like Old Spice after shave, and the lavender sachets Martha tucked into every drawer. I can't bring myself to remove them. Pine Valley OA sits upstream from my property, one of those gated developments of cookie-cutter mansions where tech executives and real estate mogul pay $12,000 in annual fees for the privilege of living behind walls. The community has its own golf course, 3 tennis courts, and a clubhouse that looks like a small hotel. The president, Veronica Ashworth, runs that place like her personal kingdom. She's 52. A former pharmaceutical sales rep who made her fortune selling blood pressure medications to cardiologists before transitioning into luxury real estate. Everything about Veronica screams expensive. The chemical sweet perfume that hits you from 20 feet away. The BMW with vanity plates reading Luxury 1. The voice that could cut glass when she's giving orders. Right now, she's trying to sell her own $890,000 mansion. Italian marble countertops, infinity pool, wine cellar that cost more than most people's cars. She needs the neighborhood looking absolutely pristine for wealthy buyers from California. The trouble started when heavy spring rains created what Veronica called unsightly pooling near their clubhouse. Standing water, she claimed, would attract mosquitoes and make the community look swampy and unprofessional to potential home buyers. Her solution? Divert Willow Creek entirely using concrete barriers, channeling all the flow through my backyard. No permits, no environmental impact study, no notice to downstream property owners like me. Just a midnight construction crew and enough concrete to build a small bridge. I woke up that Tuesday morning to the diesel rumble of heavy machinery and the chemical tang of wet concrete drifting through my bedroom window. By the time I stumbled outside in my bathrobe, they'd already installed a 3-FT concrete dam right across the creek, maybe 50 yards upstream from Martha's oak grove. The crew foreman, this big guy in a hard hat with concrete dust on his boots, barely looked up from his clipboard when I approached. HOA, work order, he grunted, pointing to official-looking paperwork. Emergency mosquito abatement project. Should be done by noon. Within hours, the effects were catastrophic. My basement started flooding as the diverted creek overwhelmed natural drainage patterns that had worked perfectly for 32 years. That musty, moldy smell crept up through the floorboards as brown water seeped through foundation cracks I'd never seen before. Worse, the massive water diversion was drowning Martha's oak grove, those trees she'd planted with her own hands during cancer remission, each one a symbol of hope and healing. I called Veronica immediately, my hands shaking with rage as I dialed her number. Her response, "Natural water management isn't our responsibility, Earl. Your property was always prone to flooding during heavy rains." That was an outright lie, and she knew it. In 32 years living here, my basement had never seen a single drop of water. But Veronica had made one critical mistake that would destroy everything she'd built. The next morning, I did what any rational person would do. I filed a formal complaint with the county environmental office. Using my EPA training, I documented everything: the unpermitted creek diversion, GPS coordinates of the illegal concrete dam, photographs of my flooded basement, water quality measurements showing contamination in my well. I included a detailed technical analysis explaining how the diversion violated the Clean Water Act, state environmental regulations, and county drainage ordinances. 30 years of federal enforcement experience made my complaint bulletproof, or so I thought. 3 days later, I got a call from Inspector Mike Castellanos. He sounded tired, like a man who'd handled too many petty neighbor disputes over property lines and barking dogs. "Mr. Hutchinson, I've reviewed your complaint about the HOA drainage project. I'll be out Friday morning to take a look and get this sorted out." Mike had a reputation as a thorough investigator, someone who actually read the technical reports and followed up on violations. I felt confident justice would prevail. Friday came and went. No inspector. I waited until 5 p.m., then called the county office. The secretary, a woman who sounded like she'd answered 10,000 similar calls, put me on hold for 15 minutes before returning with news that made my blood boil. "Mr. Hainos, sorry Hutchinson. Inspector Castellanos completed his site visit yesterday afternoon. No violations found. Case closed. That was impossible. The concrete dam was right there, visible from space if you knew where to look. I'd provided exact coordinates, detailed photographs, water flow measurements that clearly showed illegal diversion. Ma'am, the inspector never visited my property," I said carefully. According to his report, he conducted a thorough investigation from multiple vantage points. No evidence of environmental damage or unpermitted construction. Multiple vantage points from where? The International Space Stat. Ion. I drove over to the HOA clubhouse, my pickup truck rumbling past manicured lawns that probably cost more to maintain than most people's annual salaries. I found Veronica in the rose garden behind the clubhouse, wearing gardening gloves that had obviously never touched actual dirt, watering her prize-winning roses with a silver watering can. "Heard you had some trouble with your complaint," she said without looking up, her voice carrying that fake sympathy pharmaceutical rep's perfect in sales training. "The inspector never showed up at my property," I replied, trying to keep my tone civil. She turned and smiled, the kind of smile that never reaches your eyes, but works great in corporate boardrooms. Maybe he saw everything he needed to see from the clubhouse parking lot. These county people are very efficient. Something in her tone set off every alarm bell I'd developed in 30 years of federal investigations. I'd heard that same confidence before from corporate executives who thought they'd bought their way out of environmental violations. Back in my EPA days, we called it regulatory arrogance syndrome, the belief that money could make federal laws disappear. That afternoon, I called Inspector Castellanos directly, bypassing the county office entirely. Mike, I need to understand how you conducted a site inspection of my property without actually visiting my property. There was a long pause filled with the kind of silence that speaks volumes. When he finally cleared his throat, his voice had changed, less professional, more defensive. Look, Earl, sometimes these neighbor disputes, they work themselves out if you give them time. Maybe focus on working with your HOA instead of against them. The way he said work with your HOA triggered every instinct I developed in 3 decades of federal enforcement. This wasn't bureaucratic inefficiency or oversight. This was corrupt. I knew from EPA training that environmental inspectors were required by federal law to visit all affected properties before making determinations. They couldn't declare no violations based on observations from a parking lot 200 yards away. Mike's suggestion to work with the HOA violated standard investigation protocols and suggested he'd been influenced by outside pressure. So, I decided to test my theory using techniques I'd learned investigating corporate environmental crimes. The following Tuesday, I parked my pickup across from the Pine Valley Clubhouse at 10:45 a.m., right when I knew Veronica usually arrived to micromanage the landscaping crew. I brought binoculars, a telephoto camera, and the patience I developed during decades of surveillance work. Sure enough, her white BMW with the vanity plates pulled into the clubhouse parking lot at 11:15 sharp. She stepped out wearing another expensive business suit, carrying a briefcase that probably cost more than my monthly Social Security check. What I witnessed next confirmed my worst suspicions about small-town corruption. Veronica walked directly to Mike Castellanos, who was standing beside his official county inspection vehicle like he was waiting for her. She handed him a white envelope thick enough to contain cash, small enough to be discreet. The whole exchange lasted maybe 30 seconds, but it was textbook bribery. I had them on camera, but I needed audio evidence to make federal corruption charges stick. So, I did something that would either solve my problem or get me arrested. I started recording every conversation with county officials. Wednesday morning, I called Mike Castellanos again, this time with my phone set to record. Mike, I've been thinking about our conversation regarding my environmental complaint. The flooding damage to my property is getting worse, and I'd really appreciate a proper site inspe. Earl, like I told you, sometimes these neighbor situations work themselves out if you give them time. Maybe try talking to your HOA about reasonable accommodations. Accommodations for what, Mike? Environmental crimes. There was a long pause. I could almost hear him sweating through the phone. Look, Earl, you seem like a reasonable guy. These HOA folks, they have resources, connections. Sometimes it's better to work within the system than fight it. Bingo. Classic corruption language. Work within the system meant don't file complaints that might affect my income stream. Mike, I said, letting steel creep into my voice. I spent 30 years investigating federal environmental crimes. I know what corruption sounds like. You want to reconsider your position on this inspection? The silence stretched for almost 30 seconds. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost all its casual confidence. What exactly are you implying, Earl? I'm implying that I have photographs of you accepting cash payments from Veronica Ashworth. I'm implying that your inspection was purchased for whatever she put in that white envelope. And I'm implying that you have about 24 hours to schedule a legitimate inspection before I forward my evidence to the State Ethics Board and the FBI. Mike's breathing became audible. You recorded our meetings? Mike, I'm a retired federal investigator. Of course, I recorded our meetings. Question is, do you want to fix this quietly or do you want to explain your new income sources to federal agents? Friday morning brought exactly the response I'd hoped for. Mike called to schedule what he carefully termed a comprehensive environmental assessment of both my property and the HOA's concrete installation. He also mentioned that he'd be bringing a state environmental specialist as a consulting observer. But word travels fast in small communities, especially when money and company corruption are involved. By the weekend, Veronica had obviously figured out that her bribery scheme was collapsing and she was desperate to control the damage. Sunday evening, my neighbor Janet Priskel called with a warning that made my blood run cold. "Earl, I'm getting strange phone calls about you. Women asking if you seem confused lately, if your family's worried about your mental state, whether you should still be living alone." Janet's lived next door for 15 years. She'd watched Martha fight cancer, helped me navigate those final months of home hospice care, brought casseroles when I couldn't bring myself to cook. She knew exactly what these calls represented. "What kind of women, Janet?" Older voices claiming to be concerned neighbors from Pine Valley. But Earl, when I asked for their names so I could call them back, they all hung up. Monday morning brought the coordinated attack I'd expected. 3 anonymous calls reached the county environmental office, all reporting my erratic behavior and harassment of local officials. The complaints claimed I was suffering from grief-related mental decline and should not be trusted to live independently. I recognized this tactic immediately from my federal enforcement days. When corrupt businesses couldn't fight the law directly, they attacked the credibility of the investigators. Character assassination, manufactured mental health concerns, anything to discredit legitimate whistleblowing. But Veronica had made a critical error. She'd underestimated both my experience with corruption cases and my family connections. Tuesday afternoon, my daughter Sarah drove down from Portland with a briefcase full of documentation that would destroy Veronica's harassment campaign. Sarah's an environmental attorney, 42 years old, with her mother's sharp analytical mind and absolutely zero tolerance for bullies who target vulnerable people. "Dad, tell me everything," she said, settling into Martha's old chair on the back porch, where we'd had 1,000 conversations over the years. I walked her through the illegal creek diversion, the bribery scheme, the harassment campaign designed to make me look mentally incompetent. Sarah took notes in the same meticulous way she'd inherited from her mother. Every detail documented, every timeline verified, every piece of evidence cataloged. "This woman has no idea who she's messing with," Sarah said after I finished my account. "Environmental law is my specialty and corruption cases are my absolute favorite kind of work." That Wednesday morning, Sarah spent 2 hours at the county office presenting my medical records to Environmental Division Supervisor Martinez. Clean bill of health from my annual physical cognitive assessment scores in the 95th percentile. 0 indicators of mental decline or confusion. My father is one of the most qualified environmental specialists in Oregon. She told Martinez these anonymous complaints are clearly retaliatory harassment designed to silence legitimate whistleblowing about official corruption. But Sarah's visit accomplished something much more important than clearing my name. As a specialist in environmental law, she immediately recognized the federal implications of what Veronica had done. Implications that would transform this from a local drainage dispute into a federal environmental catastrophe. Wednesday evening, Sarah spread federal environmental regulations across Martha's old dining room table. The same table where Martha had planned her garden layouts during chemotherapy treatments. What my daughter discovered would turn Veronica's illegal creek diversion into an environmental nightmare. "Dad, this isn't just a county drainage issue anymore," Sarah explained, pointing to sections of the 2024 Federal Waters Protection Act. Under new federal regulations, any county drainage inspection that affects protected watersheds automatically triggers EPA wetland assessment protocols. I'd been so focused on the corruption angle that I'd missed the bigger picture. The new federal regulations were designed to prevent exactly what Veronica had done: unsupervised habitat modification by private developers who thought local bribes could override federal environmental law. Here's what's really beautiful about this situation. Sarah continued pulling up satellite images on her laptop. Willow Creek feeds directly into the Columbia River watershed. Any modifications require federal environmental review, but Veronica's concrete dam actually created something that could qualify for federal wetland protection. She showed me before and after aerial photographs. The water back up from the concrete barriers had created 3 distinct pools on the HOA side of the dam. The pools were collecting sediment, growing native vegetation, attracting waterfowl that hadn't been seen in this area for decades. Environmental assessment will focus on any protected species habitat, Sarah explained. And guess what thrives in seasonal pools exactly like these? I knew the answer immediately from my EPA training. Northwestern salamanders protected under the Endangered Species Act, Sarah confirmed. If that assessment finds salamander breeding habitat, the entire affected area becomes federally protected wetland with no possibility of appeal. That night, I couldn't sleep. Couldn't. Not from anxiety, from anticipation. I kept thinking about Martha's final words. Promise me you'll fight for what matters, Earl. Don't let them destroy beautiful things just because they can. Veronica thought she was silencing a grief-stricken old man with manufactured mental health complaints. Instead, she'd triggered a federal environmental investigation that could destroy everything she'd spent years building. But I needed to be strategic about the final phase. Sarah warned me that Veronica's pharmaceutical background meant she understood regulatory manipulation better than most people. We need to be smarter than she is, Sarah said, and we need to be prepared for whatever desperate move she makes when she realizes what's coming. Thursday morning, I got lucky in a way I never could have planned. I was checking my trail camera, the one I'd installed to monitor flooding damage, when I noticed unusual movement in the newly created pools behind Veronica's concrete dam. Small, dark shapes moving through the shallow water in patterns that triggered recognition from decades of environmental fieldwork. I grabbed my binoculars for a closer look, my heart racing with excitement. Northwestern salamander larvae, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, thriving in the accidental habitat that Veronica's environmental crime had created. But Wednesday night brought Veronica's most desperate and destructive move yet. I woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of hydraulic equipment and the sharp chemical smell of diesel exhaust drifting through my bedroom windows. Someone was operating heavy machinery near the concrete dam, trying to remove evidence under cover of darkness. I grabbed my flashlight and camera, slipping outside in my bathrobe and slippers. Through the darkness I could see work lights reflecting off Willow Creek. 3 workers in hard hats were using pneumatic jackhammers to break apart the concrete barriers, sending chunks of debris tumbling into the creek and turning the water muddy brown with sediment. Veronica was attempting to destroy evidence of federal environmental crimes. "Stop!" I shouted across the water. "You're destroying evidence of Clean Water Act violations." The crew foreman, the same guy from the original Installat, Ion, walked to the property line with the swagger of someone who'd been paid well to ignore legal complications. "Private property, old man. HOA's conducting emergency repairs to prevent flood damage to the clubhouse." At 2 a.m, without environmental permits, he shrugged with practiced indifference. "Emergency repair work doesn't require permits. Water damage threatens community safety." That was obviously fabricated justification. The clubhouse sat 50 yards uphill from the creek on engineered drainage systems that had worked perfectly for 15 years. But I understood Veronica's strategy. Remove the concrete dam, eliminate physical evidence, claim the pools were natural seasonal formations that had nothing to do with HOA construction. She'd calculated that an elderly widower wouldn't have the resources or energy to fight a coordinated cover-up involving lawyers, contractors, and corrupted officials. She was catastrophically wrong about my resources and completely ignorant about my federal connections. But Veronica's midnight demolition created an even bigger problem for her legal position. The scattered concrete chunks throughout the creek created a chaotic series of mini-dams, backing up water in unpredictable patterns that would be impossible to explain as natural formations. Instead of restoring natural creek flow, the botched demolition work had created permanent pools that were even more obvious evidence of human environmental modification. Thursday morning brought a phone call that changed everything. Sarah had spent the night researching federal environmental law, and what she'd discovered would turn Veronica's corruption scheme into a federal environmental catastrophe. "Dad, I've been reading the 2024 Federal Waters Protection Act all night," she said, her voice carrying the excitement of someone who'd found the perfect legal weapon. "This new law isn't just about wetland assessment. It's about automatic habitat designation." She explained how the regulatory framework had been completely restructured. Any county drainage inspection that identified protected species habitat now triggered immediate federal designation. No lengthy review process, no environmental impact studies, no appeals period for developers who didn't like the results. "Here's the absolutely beautiful part," Sarah continued. "Once an area receives emergency habitat protection, any previous modifications become subject to federal restoration requirements. The concrete, the channels, the demolition debris, everything has to be returned to natural conditions at the violator's expense." I understood the implications immediately, and they were staggering. The county inspection that Veronica had tried so desperately to prevent would now trigger automatic federal protection for the entire affected WED, not just my property, not just the immediate creek area. The entire Pine Valley neighborhood could fall under habitat preservation restrictions. What kind of restrictions are we talking about, Sarah? Complete development freeze for any area within the designated habitat zone. No modifications to existing structures without federal environmental permits. No landscaping changes, no pool installations, no exterior renovations, no irrigation systems. Nothing that could affect water flow or species habitat. The poetic justice was absolutely perfect. Veronica's illegal creek diversion had accidentally created protected habitat. Her corruption scheme had enhanced that habitat through water flow modifications. Her attempted cover-up had created additional habitat complexity through concrete debris placement. And the federal inspection she couldn't prevent would now lock her entire neighborhood into permanent environmental preservation. But Sarah, what happens to Propert? Why values? When federal habitat designation kicks in? Dad, that's the most beautiful part of this whole situation. Federal habitat designation typically reduces property values by 60 to 70%. Because buyers can't modify anything without federal permits that cost tens of thousands of dollars and take years to obtain. I sat in Martha's old chair on the back porch, watching sunlight dance on the salamander pools, listening to the gentle sound of water flowing over Veronica's concrete debris. The sweet smell of honeysuckle mixed with the clean scent of moving water. For the first time since Martha's funeral, I felt genuinely at peace with the universe. Martha had always believed in what she called cosmic justice, the idea that good actions eventually create positive outcomes, while destructive actions contain the seeds of their own destruction. She would be laughing with pure delight at the irony of this situation. "There's one more thing, Dad," Sarah said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "As the property owner who first documented the protected habitat, you're eligible to become the federal habitat monitor for the designated area. It's a paid position, $65,000 a year plus benefits, specifically designed for retired environmental specialists with your qualifications and a federal job, health insurance, steady income, and most importantly, the legal authority to protect Martha's Oak Grove forever under the full power of federal environmental law." But I had to be absolutely strategic about the final phase. Veronica still had time to cause irreparable damage if she panicked and attempted more demolition work. The county inspection was scheduled for Tuesday morning, which gave me 5 days to ensure everything went perfectly. "Sarah, I need you to coordinate directly with the state wildlife specialist. Make sure they understand the full scope of the accidental habitat enhancement that Veronica's crimes have created. Already working on it, Dad. Dr. Rebecca Declan is bringing a complete assessment team, herpetologist, hydrologist, vegetation specialist, federal observer. They want to document this site as a model case study for accidental habitat restoration through environmental crime. That afternoon, I walked through Martha's oak grove, touching each tree she'd planted during her cancer remission. The trees were recovering beautifully from the initial flooding damage, with new growth appearing on branches that had seemed dead just weeks ago. The salamander pools reflected afternoon sunlight filled with the quiet movement of protected life that would soon be guarded by federal law. Tomorrow, Veronica would learn that her corruption and environmental destruction had triggered the very federal intervention she'd spent thousands of dollars trying to prevent. Friday night, I couldn't sleep, not from worry, but from the pure anticipation of watching 30 years of environmental enforcement experience crystallize into one perfect trap. I spent the hours until dawn organizing every piece of evidence, every legal precedent, every federal regulation that would destroy Veronica's world. First came the physical preparation. Using GPS equipment I'd kept from my EPA days, I mapped every salamander pool, every piece of concrete debris, every water flow pattern that Veronica's crimes had created. The scattered demolition chunks weren't just random rubble. They'd formed natural oak check dams that created ideal amphibian breeding conditions, shallow pools connected by gentle riffles, rocky substrate for egg attachment, steady water temperature regulation, abundant insect food sources. Veronica's environmental vandalism had accidentally engineered perfect northwestern salamander nursery habitat. Working by flashlight in the pre-dawn darkness, I planted Noddy, VE wetland species around the pools. Nothing invasive, nothing that would compromise natural ecosystem development, just strategic enhancement of vegetation that was already establishing itself. Cattails, rush grass, Pacific ninebark, monkey flower. The rich smell of pond mud clung to my boots as I worked, reminding me of childhood creek explorations with my grandfather. Saturday morning brought the legal strategy phase. Sarah arrived with 2 briefcases full of federal environmental documentation, habitat protection protocols, species assessment criteria, enforcement procedures, case law precedents. We spread everything across Martha's dining room table, creating a command center for environmental warfare. "Here's the timeline, Dad," Sarah explained, consulting federal regulatory schedules. County Inspector Mike Castellanos arrives Tuesday at 9 a.m., accompanied by State Environmental Specialist David Park. If they confirm protected breeding habitat, which they absolutely will, federal designation becomes automatic and irreversible by noon that same day. And then what happens? Emergency protection status kicks in immediately. No modifications permitted anywhere in the designated area. Restoration requirements begin within 30 days. Property use restrictions take effect permanently. But Sarah had researched something even more powerful than simple habitat protection. Dad, the 2024 Waters Protection Act includes a special provision for habitat enhancement monitoring positions. If you accept the federal monitor appointment, you'll have law enforcement authority over the entire designated area. Law enforcement authority, the power to issue federal citations for habitat violations. After 30 years of environmental protection work, I'd have the legal authority to ensure no one could ever threaten Martha's Grove again. Sunday afternoon brought the financial calculations that devastate Pine Valley's wealthy residents. I spread property tax assessments and real estate valuations across my kitchen table, running numbers that made me smile with grim satisfaction. Current Pine Valley property values, $43 million total for all neighborhood homes. Post-designation conservation values, approximately $15 million. Total property value destruction from Veronica's environmental crimes, $28 million. More specifically, Veronica's $890,000 mansion would become worth maybe $200,000 as conservation-restricted property. Her wealthy neighbors would lose similar percentages. Tech executives discovering their million-dollar investments had become 4 million environmental preservation sites. But the financial devastation extended beyond property values. The HOA's $12,000 annual maintenance fees would become federally illegal. Habitat preservation prohibits all non-essential human activities within designated areas. No landscaping crews, no pool maintenance, no irrigation systems, no exterior modifications of any kind. Monday morning, I met with Dr. Rebecca Declan and her federal assessment team at the county environmental office. The lead scientist was genuinely excited about documenting what she called exceptional accidental habitat creation through environmental crime remediation. Mr. Hutchinson, Dr. Declan explained, consulting species protection databases, this site represents the most significant northwestern salamander population recovery we've recorded in the Columbia River, worst in over 2 decades. We'll be recommending federal designation as a model conservation success story. The technical explanation was elegant in its simplicity. When you illegally divert a natural creek, you sometimes accidentally create superior habitat conditions compared to what nature provided originally. Translation: Veronica's environmental crime had become an environmental miracle. Monday evening brought the final coordination phase. Sarah had arranged for environmental advocacy groups to conduct coincidental wildlife surveys during the official inspection. 3 wildlife photographers, 2 graduate students from Portland State University, and a freelance journalist specializing in conservation success stories, all perfectly legal, all beautifully timed to document federal habitat designation as it happened. At 8 p.m., I called Tom Bradley to explain Tuesday's timeline. Tom, by Wednesday morning, your foundation repair becomes the HOA's legal responsibility under federal habitat restoration requirements. They'll have to fix everything their environmental crimes damaged, and the property value situation. Your property taxes will drop from $8,000 a year to under $0,000 due to conservation easement status. Plus, the federal government covers all restoration costs. Tom was quiet for a moment, absorbing the implications. Earl, you've managed to turn environmental disaster into financial blessing. Tuesday morning at 6 a.m., I walked through Martha's Oak Grove one final time before the inspection that would change everything. The trees stood strong and healthy, recovered from flood damage, protected forever by what would soon become federal environmental law. The salamander pools reflected sunrise colors filled with protected life that represented Martha's deepest values: conservation, healing, hope for future generations. In 3 hours, Veronica would learn that corruption and environmental destruction had consequences she'd never imagined. At 7:30 Tuesday morning, just as I was preparing final documentation for the federal inspection, Veronica made her most desperate and self-destructive move yet. I was reviewing salamander population counts when I heard her voice cutting through morning air like fingernails on a chalkboard. She was on. Her phone in her backyard, maybe 40 yards from where federal biologists would soon be working. But panic had made her voice carry across the entire neighborhood. What do you mean you can't stop a federal inspection? I paid you to handle county problems. She was obviously screaming at someone in county government, probably poor Mike Castellanos, who was about to have the worst day of his professional career. No, absolutely not. Cancel it immediately. Do you understand what this could do to property values? I watched through my kitchen window as Veronica paced her back deck, gesturing wildly with her free hand. She'd obviously spent the night researching federal environmental law and finally understood the catastrophic implications of what she'd triggered. $10,000 cash. Just make the inspection go away. At 8:15, I watched Veronica march across her back lawn toward the county vehicle that had just parked near the creek access point. She was wearing what I call her corporate intimidation outfit. Dark power suit, serious heels, briefcase that probably cost more than my monthly Social Security check. she approached Inspector Mike Castellanos and State Environmental Specialist David Park with the kind of determined stride pharmaceutical sales reps use when entering hostile hospital administration offices. "Gentlemen, I'm Veronica Ashworth, Pine Valley HOA president," she announced, extending a manicured hand that neither man accepted. "I understand there's been some confusion about our recent drainage improvements, and I'm here to clarify the situation." Mike Castellanos actually stepped backward, sweat already staining his county uniform despite the cool morning air. He obviously knew this conversation was being recorded by federal assessment equipment. "Miss Ashworth, this is a routine environmental inspection," he said weakly. "There's nothing routine about it," Veronica snapped. "Our drainage work was emergency flood prevention. Completely legal, completely necessary for community safety." David Park looked up from the water quality meter he'd been calibrating. "Ma'am, I'm documenting protected species habitat. The legality of your construction work isn't within my jurisdiction." Veronica's confidence flickered momentarily. "Protected species? That's impossible. We hired environmental consultants before beginning any work. Ma'am, I'm looking at what appears to be the healthiest northwestern salamander breeding population I've documented in 5 years of field work." I watched Veronica's face cycle through confusion, recognition, and pure rage as she finally understood the federal implications of her environmental crimes. She'd spent months coordinating her mansion sale, timing market conditions, managing buyer expectations. Now, a federal biologist was explaining why her property had just become worthless conservation land. "This is absolutely ridiculous," she said, her voice rising to near hysteria. "Some grieving old man files a complaint, and suddenly we have endangered species in our neighborhood." That's when Veronica committed the federal crime that would destroy her completely. She pulled out her phone and made a call while standing directly in front of federal environmental assessment equipment that was recording everything for official documentation purposes. "Jim, it's Veronica Ashworth. I need you to cancel that federal inspection happening right now on Pine Valley property." She paused, listening to whoever Jim was, then continued with words that would soon be presented as evidence in federal court. $10,000 cash, same arrangement we discussed for the county situation. Just make these federal people go away before they ruin everything. David Park stopped all pretense of working and stared at Veronica with the kind of horror federal employees are. A serve for witnessing crimes against their agencies. Dr. Declan, who had just arrived with additional documentation equipment, immediately started recording with her personal phone. "Miss Ashworth," David said very carefully, "are you attempting to influence a federal environmental assessment by offering financial compensation to federal employees?" Veronica realized her catastrophic mistake about 3 seconds too late. The pharmaceutical sales training that had served her so well in corporate environments had just led her to commit federal bribery charges in front of witnesses. We're just concerned about protecting property values for hard-working homeowners." "Ma'am," Dr. Declan interrupted, holding up her recording phone, "you just attempted to bribe federal environmental scientists conducting protected species assessment. This conversation is being documented for the FBI Environmental Crimes Unit." The words FBI and environmental crimes seemed to penetrate Veronica's panic like ice water. She stared at Dr. Declan's phone, finally understanding that her corruption strategies had created federal criminal evidence. "I think I need to call my attorney," she said, her voice suddenly small and shaky. "That's an excellent idea," David Park replied. "You'll also want to contact FBI Special Agent Maria Santos in Portland. She specializes in environmental crime prosecutions." As Veronica stumbled back toward her mansion, Mike Castellanos approached me with the defeated expression of a man whose career had just ended. "Earl, I'm resigning from county service today, filing my corruption report with the district attorney this afternoon." By Wednesday morning, Veronica was in complete panic mode. The federal habitat designation was now public record, posted on environmental databases that real estate agents check religiously. She had exactly 48 hours before her mansion closing was supposed to finalize $890,000 about to evaporate into worthless conservation property. I learned about her final desperate scheme from my neighbor Tom Bradley, who'd been monitoring HOA communications through his wife's position on the Architectural Review Committee. "Earl, she called an emergency board meeting for 6 a.m. Thursday," Tom told me Wednesday evening. According to Linda, Veronica is claiming the federal environmental situation is temporary and completely appealable. She's telling her buyers that habitat designation can be overturned through proper legal channels. That was technically possible, but practically impossible under current federal law. Northwestern salamander habitat designations based on established breeding populations are almost never reversed, especially when the habitat enhancement resulted from illegal environmental modifications. But Veronica was obviously counting on her buyers not understanding the complexities of federal environmental law. The purchase contract was scheduled to close Friday afternoon, just barely ahead of the federal enforcement timeline that would make the sale impossible. Sarah and I spent Wednesday night researching Oregon real estate disclosure requirements, building a legal case that would destroy Veronica's fraudulent sale attempt. "Dad, if she closes this sale without disclosing the federal investigation and habitat restrictions, she's committing federal wire fraud in addition to all the environmental crimes," Sarah explained, scrolling through legal databases on her laptop. "Wire fraud, interstate commerce, electronic fund transfers, mail system usage, federal jurisdiction applies automatically to real estate transactions involving out-of-state buyers." Thursday morning at 5 a.m., I positioned myself in Tom Bradley's backyard with binoculars and telephoto camera equipment. If Veronica was planning another cover-up scheme, I wanted complete documentation for federal prosecutors. The HOA emergency board meeting started precisely on schedule in the Pine Valley clubhouse. Through high-powered binoculars, I could observe Veronica presenting documents to 5 board members, her real estate attorney, and what appeared to be an environmental consultant she'd hired overnight. At 6:30, I witnessed something that made my blood run absolutely cold. Veronica was showing the group a stack of official-looking papers, obviously forged federal environmental clearances, claiming the salamander population was seasonal migrant species with no permanent breeding establishment. She was manufacturing fake federal documents to deceive buyers and circumvent habitat protection law. I called Sarah immediately. She's creating fraudulent environmental reports with forged federal agency letterheads. "How do we stop this sale? Dad, document everything you're witnessing. I'm calling the buyer's attorney right now to warn them about federal crimes in progress." At 7:15 a.m., I called the buyers directly. Robert and Jennifer Patterson, a retired couple from Sacramento who'd planned to relocate to Oregon for environmental reasons. The irony was almost too perfect. "Mr. Patterson, this is Earl Hutchinson, your future neighbor in Pine Valley. I'm calling about urgent developments affecting your property purchase." "Oh yes, Earl." Robert Patterson's voice was friendly, trusting. "Veronica mentioned you might call with concerns about recent landscaping changes," she said. "You're very particular about maintaining neighborhood character. Mr. Patterson, has Veronica disclosed the federal environmental investigation currently affecting your property?" Long silence. "Then what federal investigation?" I explained the habitat designation, the federal protection status, the permanent development restrictions that would affect their property forever. Robert Patterson's silence stretched for almost 2 minutes. "Mr. Hutchinson, are you telling me that our new home is now federally protected environmental preserve?" "The entire neighborhood, sir. No swimming pools, no additions, no landscaping modifications, no exterior changes without federal environmental permits that cost tens of thousands of dollars and take years to obtain. But we're supposed to close tomorrow afternoon. We've already transferred the down payment." "Mr. Patterson, I'd strongly recommend consulting with an environmental attorney before signing any additional documents." Thursday afternoon brought the revenge I'd been anticipating for weeks. The Pattersons' attorney, David Kim from Sacramento, called Veronica, demanding immediate disclosure of all environmental restrictions affecting the property sale. When Veronica provided her forged federal environmental clearances, Kim immediately recognized them as fraudulent documents. The EPA regional director, whose signature appeared on the clearances, had died 3 years earlier. The federal agency letterheads contained spelling errors that no government office would make. Miss Ashworth, Kim told her in a recorded conversation that Sarah later obtained through legal channels, these documents appear to be forgeries of federal environmental reports. I'm forwarding them immediately to the FBI Document Analysis Unit. At 3 p.m., Sarah called with news that made me actually laugh out loud. Dad, the sale just collapsed completely. The Pattersons are suing Veronica for fraud, misrepresentation, conspiracy, and intentional concealment. Their attorney is also filing criminal referrals with the FBI for document forgery and wire fraud. But Veronica's legal catastrophe was just beginning to unfold. Friday afternoon at 2 p.m., Pine Valley hosted the most explosive town hall meeting in the community's 15-year history. What started as an emergency HOA session to address recent environmental complications became a public trial of corruption, environmental crime, and the spectacular downfall of a petty tyrant. The clubhouse was packed beyond capacity with over 200 residents, plus overflow seating on the pool deck and front lawn. Local news crews had arrived after receiving tips about federal environmental crime investigations. The air conditioning system couldn't handle the crowd, so windows were thrown open, carrying heated voices across the neighborhood. FBI Special Agent Maria Santos sat in the front row with a briefcase full of federal evidence, bribery recordings, forged documents, environmental crime documentation. David Park had his official habitat designation paperwork ready for public presentation. Dr. Declan brought photographic displays showing the protected salamander population that would control everyone's future. And I sat in the back with Sarah, watching Veronica's carefully constructed world collapse in front of every person who trusted her leadership. Board Chairman Robert Hriss called the meeting to order with obvious reluctance, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool autumn air. We're here to address recent developments regarding federal environmental restrictions that may affect our community. Veronica stood immediately wearing the same power suit she'd worn while attempting to bribe federal officials. Her voice still carried that pharmaceutical sales confidence, but I could hear desperation crackling underneath like static electricity. Ladies and gentlemen, we're dealing with a temporary regulatory misunderstanding that's being deliberately blown out of proportion by certain individuals with personal grudges against community leadership. She gestured vaguely in my direction without making eye contact. Federal environmental designations can be appealed through proper legal channels, especially when they're based on biased reporting from disgruntled neighbors who lack professional environmental expertise. Agent Santos stood up slowly, her federal credentials glinting under fluorescent lights. Ma'am, I'm Special Agent Maria Santos, FBI Environmental Crimes Unit. There is no appeal process for habitat designation based on documented protected species breeding activity. The clubhouse went dead silent, except for the hum of failing air conditioning. Veronica's face flushed bright red as she realized federal law enforcement was about to contradict everything she'd promised her neighbors. Furthermore, Agent Santos continued, consulting her notes, this investigation has expanded far beyond environmental violations. We're currently investigating charges of official corruption, wire fraud, document forgery, and conspiracy to obstruct federal environmental enforcement. Resident Steve Morrison, a tech executive who'd paid cash for his $1 million home, raised his hand with visible anxiety. Agent Santos, what exactly does federal habitat designation mean for our property values? David Park answered with scientific precision. Federal habitat designation typically reduces affected property values by 60 to 70%. However, your property taxes will decrease proportionally, and residents receive federal conservation tax benefits. The room erupted like a volcano. 200 voices shouting questions, demands, accusations, threats of lawsuits. I caught fragments of panicked conversations. Veronica promised this was temporary. My pool renovation permits are worthless now. How much are our homes actually worth? Can we sue the HOA for fraud? Janet Morrison, Tom Bradley's wife, stood on her chair to address the crowd. Everyone needs to understand something important. Veronica knew about this federal investigation when she scheduled my mansion sale closing. She's been deliberately lying to every single one of us. That's completely untrue, Veronica shouted back, her professional composure finally cracking. I was protecting this community from environmental extremists who want to destroy property rights. That's when I stood up. The room gradually quieted as residents turned to look at me. Earl Hutchinson, the quiet widower they'd seen tending Martha's garden for 15 years, the man whose environmental complaint had triggered this catastrophe. Veronica, I said, my voice carrying clearly across the packed clubhouse. You destroyed my wife's memorial grove with an illegal creek diversion conducted without permits or environmental review. You bribed county officials to cover up Clean Water Act violations. You forged federal environmental documents to deceive homebuyers. I paused, making sure every person in that room understood the stakes. But here's what you never understood about federal environmental law. Sometimes criminal environmental destruction accidentally creates something more valuable than what you destroyed. David Park held up his official habitat assessment photographs. The illegal creek diversion inadvertently created the healthiest northwestern salamander breeding habitat documented in the Columbia River watershed in over 20 years. Your corruption, I continued, looking directly at Veronica, triggered federal environmental protection that will preserve this ecosystem forever. Your greed and environmental crimes transformed a luxury neighborhood into a conservation success story that will be studied by environmental scientists for decades. The room was completely silent now, every resident absorbing the full irony of their situation. Veronica, you asked me what I intended to do about your environmental crimes. Here's your complete answer. I'm accepting the federal habitat monitor positio. For the next 20 years, I'll have full law enforcement authority over every square inch of this federally protected area. I smiled at her shocked expression. Congratulations, Veronica. Your $890,000 mansion is now worth approximately $200,000. And thanks to permanent federal habitat protection, it will stay at that value forever. The crowd turned toward Veronica, 200 pairs of eyes, waiting for her response to the complete destruction of everything she'd built. She stood there in her expensive suit, briefcase, trembling in her hands, finally understanding that corporate manipulation tactics don't work against federal environmental law. This is absolutely insane, she said, her voice breaking. You people are letting one bitter old man destroy our entire community over some stupid salamanders. Agent Santos approached the microphone with handcuffs ready. Veronica Ashworth, you're under arrest for conspiracy to violate federal environmental law, corruption of public officials, wire fraud, and forgery of federal documents. And as the handcuffs clicked shut, Veronica made one final statement that perfectly captured her complete disconnect from environmental reality. This is all his fault. I was just trying to improve property values. 8 months later, Pine Valley looks like a completely different world, and I mean that in the most beautiful way imaginable. The federal habitat designation brought changes none of us could have predicted. Property taxes dropped from an average of $8,000 per year to under $900 due to conservation easement status. HOA fees were eliminated entirely. Federal law strictly prohibits non-essential maintenance activities in protected species habitat. Veronica's mansion sold at federal foreclosure auction for $168,000. The buyer, Dr. Sarah Martinez, an environmental science professor from Portland State University, who's converting the property into a field research station for graduate student studies in wetland restoration and salamander conservation biology. The federal corruption trial concluded with Mike Castellanos receiving 2 years probation plus community service in exchange for complete testimony against Veronica. She wasn't nearly so fortunate. Wire fraud, document forgery, conspiracy to violate federal environmental laws, and attempted bribery of federal officials earned her 42 months in federal prison, plus restitution payments to defrauded homebuyers. But the real transformation has been environmental, and Martha would have been absolutely thrilled. Without constant landscaping crews running mowers and blowers, native vegetation has returned to areas that were sterile monoculture grass for 15 years. The salamander population has more than tripled, spreading throughout the watershed. We've documented nesting pairs of great blue heron, a family of river otters, and even a beaver colony that moved in last spring and built an engineering marvel of a dam upstream from Veronica's concrete debris. Martha would have spent hours photographing those beavers. My new position as federal habitat monitor pays $68,000 annually, plus full health insurance and federal retirement benefits. More importantly, it gives me legal authority to protect this ecosystem forever under the complete power of federal environmental law. I carry a federal badge and have citation authority for any environmental violations within the designated area. Last month, a development company from Seattle attempted to purchase 4 Pine Valley properties for what they called conservation-compatible luxury development. I explained that federal habitat protection doesn't recognize compatible development exceptions. They canceled their purchase agreements the same afternoon. Tom Bradley's foundation was completely repaired at federal expense as part of mandatory habitat restoration requirements. His property value dropped significantly, but his conservation easement eliminated his mortgage entirely. Banks cannot foreclose on federally protected conservation land, and his property taxes dropped by 87%. Earl, he told me recently, while helping me monitor salamander egg masses, I'm actually making money on this whole situation. No mortgage payments, minimal property taxes, and federal grants covering all maintenance costs. Sarah visits every weekend now, often bringing her 2 daughters to explore their grandmother's oak grove and learn about amphibian life cycles. The trees have not just recovered from the initial flooding damage. They're growing stronger and taller than ever before, fed by the natural nutrient cycling that healthy wetlands provide. Sometimes I catch Sarah having quiet conversations with Martha under the big oak tree, updating her mother on environmental law developments and conservation victories nationwide. The local elementary school has officially adopted our site as their permanent outdoor classroom. Every Friday morning, 35 fourth graders arrive with magnifying glasses, field notebooks, and infectious enthusiasm for discovering salamander larvae and native plant identification. Dr. Declan leads the educational programming, turning Veronica's environmental crimes into hands-on conservation success stories for the next generation. We've established the Martha Hutchinson Environmental Education Fund, providing scholarships for students pursuing careers in environmental protection and restoration. The fund receives donations from conservation organizations across the country who've heard our story through environmental education networks. Next month, the Environmental Protection Agency is sending a documentary production crew to film our site as a featured example of accidental habitat restoration. See on through environmental crime remediation. They plan to use Pine Valley as a training case study for environmental enforcement officers nationwide. I still wake up some mornings half expecting to hear concrete mixers and diesel engines destroying something beautiful. Instead, I hear creek water flowing over natural stone beds, woodpecker drumming echoing through Martha's oak grove, and the gentle splash of beaver families working on their dam renovation projects upstream. The house no longer smells like lavender sachets and old memories. It smells like fresh coffee, clean creek air, and the wild roses that have colonized what used to be Veronica's prize-winning garden. Martha's memorial grove has become something far more significant than either of us originally imagined, a federally protected ecosystem that will educate children about environmental stewardship and species conservation for generations to come. Sometimes when I'm updating daily habitat monitoring reports in the evening, I find myself talking to Martha's old chair about wildlife observations and conservation victories. Counted 47 salamander egg masses today. I'll tell the empty chair, the great blue heron are building a second nest in your oak grove. I know she's proud of how environmental justice found its way home. Thanks for listening to this story. If you've got HOA nightmares or environmental justice stories of your own, drop them in the comments below. I genuinely love hearing how ordinary people fight back against corruption and environmental destruction.